I think one of the things we know is that hurt people. And people who are victims of gun violence need to have the opportunity and the resources to fully heal from that traumatic experience so that we're not perpetuating a cycle of violence.
In 2023, nearly 4 million people aged 12 or older experienced violent victimization in the United States, facing an estimated $98.3 billion in total costs related to their victimization.
For me, to get back up and go back to work was a really big struggle for me because my job was fast-paced. I needed to be taken care of also. I needed my healing. People think, oh, it's been 5 years. Oh, it's been 10. Well, next month I come up on 16. We never forget. It's every day for us.
Every state has a crime victim compensation program that can provide some financial relief when all their resources are exhausted. Unfortunately, where you live and who you are can impact your access to victim compensation.
There are so many great programs out there, but people either don't know about them or there's not enough funding to support them for the people who actually need them.
In 2023, even though over 3 million Americans experienced violent victimization, state victim compensation programs received applications for only about 230,000 people. While not all victims need compensation, these programs too often are underutilized. We know that this is driven in large part by restrictive state laws which create unnecessary barriers to access. Black and brown communities, which are disproportionately impacted by violence and are systematically under-resourced, bear the heaviest burden of these policies. States have an opportunity right now to change state laws to ensure we are not turning our back on survivors and that we make victim compensation programs more equitable, transparent, and accessible for the communities most at risk.
People talk about the U.S. being a land of peace and prosperity, but gun violence is a direct contradiction of all of those values. What we need is the funding, we need the support to make up for that, to restore that peace and prosperity to be successful.
Thank you for everyone for joining us today to learn more about this exciting new resource for advocates and policymakers interested in improving access and equity in state victim compensation programs. My name is Nick Wilson, and I'm the Senior Director of Gun Violence Prevention at the Center for American Progress. First, some housekeeping. Live captioning is available under the Closed Captions tab on the bottom of your screen. We'll be taking your questions at the end of the program, so feel free to submit them using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. A recording of this event will be available on CAP's website once the event concludes. The report, executive summary, and state scorecards will be shared in the chat throughout the event. Throughout my career, whether it was working with domestic violence survivors in Maine or helping oversee victim services in the Baltimore City Mayor's office, I've seen how transformative victim compensation and supportive services can be to families and communities. In my 3 years at CAP, I've had the privilege to work with so many survivors of gun violence and heard their stories of recovery and healing. Many survivors for mass shootings have told me about how their communities were instantly flooded with every resource imaginable, and it made a huge difference to them and their communities. I've also heard from survivors, especially Black and brown survivors in neighborhoods with high rates of community violence, who didn't even know about victim compensation or didn't receive the resources they needed. There are many victim service advocates and criminal justice reform organizations who've been working on addressing these gaps for many years. My hope is that gun violence prevention groups will join domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and other organizations centering the experiences of all crime survivors, like the Alliance for Safety and Justice, to work together to meet the needs of all survivors of violence. Hope After Harm, Reimagining Victim Compensation, is a result of 18 months of focus groups with survivors and service providers, engagement with state victim compensation administrators, and careful analysis of every state's victim compensation law. This report and accompanying 52 fact sheets are rich with information and resources. And after this event, I hope you'll dig into the full report, look deeply at your state fact sheet, and please reach out to us with any questions. When CAP and Common Justice started this project, we were energized by a federal effort to make significant updates to crime victim compensation guidelines for the first time in 20 years. The Office of Victims of Crime under the Biden administration did a multi-year engagement of state compensation program administrators, victims and survivors, advocates, and other stakeholders to identify opportunities to reduce common obstacles to accessing compensation. That engagement informed a VOCA victim compensation proposed rule that the OVC published in the Federal Registrar in February of 2024. The OVC received nearly 4,000 comments during the 60-day comment period. And despite strong efforts by the leaders of the Office of Victims of Crime and the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, the department unfortunately withdrew the proposed rule from the rulemaking process in January of this year. This was disappointing, and there are many reasons why it didn't come quite past the finish line, but the proposed updates are still available online, and we believe this helps build momentum for future opportunities. Even though the federal rules weren't finalized, we always knew that states would have discretion on how to implement a new guidance, and advocates would have to engage states to make improvements. I believe this makes CAP and Common Justice's new resource analysis even more vital. Recent reforms expand eligibility for survivors, increase compensation, and ensure more sustainable funding have taken place across the country. During the panel discussion, you'll hear from people who worked tirelessly to pass legislation in New York and Maryland. State and local advocates, plus national organizations like Alliance for Safety and Justice, have also passed reforms in California, Illinois, Michigan, Kentucky, and Ohio. I want to thank the survivors who were on this webinar. A special shout out to the survivors who participated in this research, especially the ones who didn't have the best experience with their victim compensation program and want to ensure that others in the future have a better experience. Thank you to the administrators on this call who provided feedback and who worked so hard to make sure survivors get the feedback they're entitled to. This report is not a reflection of their performance or actions of administrators. It's about the laws written by the state legislators. And I know many state administrators go above and beyond to serve their communities, and despite legal restrictions. We must continue to fight for federal funding, especially as the current administration attempts to politicize a non-political issue by threatening to withhold funds from so-called sanctuary cities. Reforming crime victim compensation is just the first step in making sure survivors are treated well by hospitals, law enforcement, courts, and get housing, legal services, culturally competent mental health services, and everything else that helps promote healing and break the cycles of violence. To everyone who is less familiar with victim compensation and VOCA, I hope you will be energized after this event, and after reading the report, you'll join us in a state-by-state approach to policy changes to promote healing and break the cycles of violence. Now I'm happy to hand it over to my colleague, Chandler Hall, one of the co-authors of this report.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Nick. And hello, everyone. I want to first say thank you to everyone for joining us, and also everyone behind the scenes today who helped make today possible. We're really excited to share this new research with you all, so let's get started. Next slide, please. Again, today here at the Center for American Progress and Common Justice, we're excited to announce the joint release of our report, Hope After Harm, an Evaluation of State Victim Compensation Statutes. Over the next 15 minutes, I'll be going over very briefly how we conceived of and developed this project, but I really encourage everyone to take some time after this presentation to look at the full report to really get a sense of this project's design and how it can be most useful to your organization and work. I also want to point out that in addition to the report, we produced 52 state and program fact sheets, so encourage everyone as well to make sure you take a look at your state's information. Next slide, please. As mentioned, this was a joint venture between the Center for American Progress and Common Justice. We'll be sharing links in the chat to both of our organization's pages, so please follow those to learn more about us. Next slide. So as has already been shared, when violence does occur, few people are prepared for the unexpected trauma, injury, and expense that can result. And while financial support alone cannot eliminate the lifelong pain and trauma associated with victimization, research shows that financial induced stress following harm is a stronger predictor of the development of post-traumatic stress disorder than victimization itself. Further echoing what we heard Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor Austin Davis say in the opening video, that hurt people, we unfortunately know this to be true. And while most survivors of violence do not engage in future violence, people who commit violence often have experienced it themselves. In this way, state victim compensation programs have the potential to not only be a vital lifeline to individuals and families who are made victims of violent crime, but can be an essential tool to breaking future cycles of harm. Today, however, state victim compensation programs are falling short of that potential. And this is due in large part to state policies that create unnecessary barriers for those seeking this healing resource. While federal guidelines do exist mandating that state victim compensation programs cover certain out-of-pocket expenses, states have broad autonomy over policymaking and administration of their victim compensation programs. In practice, this has resulted in disparities with access. This is especially true of Black and Brown communities, which, while historically are at the highest risk of experiencing violent victimization, are the least likely to access victim services. And as such, without a clear understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of state statute, governing victim compensation programs, and a way for change makers to demand more equitable access to this vital resource, victim compensation programs will continue to be underutilized by those most in need of their support, and these injustices will persist. Next slide, please. So this motivated us here at the Center for American Progress and a Common Justice to create what we are calling the State Victim Compensation Statute Rubric. This rubric is for evaluating state statute and regulations that govern crime victim compensation programs, which considers many of the most common barriers faced by survivors when trying to navigate the victim compensation system. In addition to the rubric and evaluation, as part of this project, we provide 5 key recommendations for statutory and programmatic reform, along with a series of corresponding model policies to support states in reforming their statute. Our goal in creating this resource is to fill critical knowledge gaps and catalyze state-level policy changes that improve access, equity, and transparency in the administration of victim compensation awards. Next slide, please. I'd like to first start off by talking a little bit about how we developed this resource. Next slide. So to begin, we used a mixed methods, 2-tiered approach to create this rubric. To begin, we examined statutes and administrative code for all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico to identify 30 common factors governing program administration and develop a scoring framework that considers how inclusive and trauma-informed states' governing language is compared to a model version. To better understand and ground this evaluation in the experience of survivors across the country, we held a series of focus groups to hear directly from survivors to learn about what they face in the wake of their harm. In addition to focus groups with survivors, we engaged victim service providers, advocates, and administrators. As survivors are the experts of their own experience and know firsthand the strengths and weaknesses of the victim compensation program, we use their insights as a guide for thinking about our analysis of statute and accordingly weighted our rubric based on the priorities they shared with us. Importantly, as Nick emphasized already, we don't evaluate survivor outcomes. We are not assessing the efficacy, efficiency, or fairness of the administration of victim compensation programs in each state. Instead, we are examining the statute and regulations that govern them, which, if reformed, also hold the potential to improve and ease the administration of victim compensation. Next slide, please. So using this approach, we identified 4 focus areas to which individual provisions in statute were assigned. As you can see, those 4 areas we identified are compensation limits. This includes statutorily defined eligible expense categories and limits to compensation relative to estimated costs, awareness and accessibility. This includes statutorily defined limits to reporting harm and applying for compensation, requirements in statute to inform victims, and offering of diverse language services. Barriers to eligibility. This includes provisions in statute which may result in limiting or denying compensation to a survivor based on their incarceration history, perceived cooperation with law enforcement, perceived conduct leading up to the harm, and more. And then finally, experience with victim compensation process. This includes access to emergency awards, which can mitigate against financial hardship in the immediate aftermath of harm, and inclusion of survivor perspectives at the administrative level. Next slide, please. Next, for each provision, depending on the category it was assigned, it was then weighted accordingly, as you can see on your screen. And again, this was based on our focus group conversations and how the survivors we spoke with prioritized these aspects of engaging with the victim compensation system. As you can see, the survivors we spoke with shared that barriers to eligibility was most impactful to their experience receiving compensation and healing in the aftermath of harm. Next slide, please. So next, I'd like to share some key findings from this analysis with you. On the next slide. So across all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and Washington, D.C., the median weighted cumulative score from this evaluation was about 27 out of a possible 57.25 points, which was about 46% of total possible points that could be earned. What this means is that only 22 of the 52 state programs that we evaluated received equal to or more than half of the total possible points that could be awarded. While this analysis therefore makes clear that no state statute provides a perfect model for victim compensation, one of the most important findings is that, as you can see from this figure shown, every region of the United States is represented by a top 10 state according to the rubric. This demonstrates that aspects of a strong victim compensation program can be found nationwide, and this is not a typical left or right issue. States across the country in hosting and reforming victim compensation programs clearly embrace the universal value that victims and survivors deserve support in the healing process. I also want to note at this point, again, that for every state and program evaluated in this rubric, we've created individual score breakdowns with detailed explanations of how and why they were scored the way they were. And those can be found along with the report. So again, if you have any questions about how your state was scored or why it was scored that way or where it ranks, we encourage you to follow up and look at those. So for the time that we have in this presentation, I'd like to talk about some of the overall trends that we found in this analysis, although certainly not an exhaustive list. Next slide. To begin, we heard many stories of survivors who were made almost paralyzed in the immediate aftermath of their harm as they processed their grief, some unable to get up out of bed or even pick up the phone when called. We believe there should be no timeline for healing or additional administrative burdens placed on those that need extra time. Despite this, 35 states place a time limit for victims to report their harm to law enforcement in order to be eligible to receive a victim compensation award. Of the states that establish a reporting window, some require victims report their harm in as little as 48 hours after the incident. Next slide, please. Further, we believe survivors should not be saddled with debt during their healing process. Yet only 11 states have compensation caps at or above the average cost for a victim of robbery after adjusting for the cost of living in their state. And this is even after including all catastrophic or permanent injury expansion clauses that some states use to offer additional avenues for compensation. And yet still, again, only about 11 states have what we would consider an adequate compensation cap. Next slide, please. Finally, we heard many testimonies of survivors who shared that they do not feel comfortable going to law enforcement due to the fear for their safety or that they will not be believed. And despite the 2021 VOCA Fix Act clarifying that state programs may waive that requirement to promote victim cooperation with law enforcement in order to be eligible to receive victim compensation, 46 states still make cooperation with law enforcement a requirement in order to be eligible to receive victim compensation. And while many of those 46 states do acknowledge that there are good causes for why someone would be unable to cooperate with law enforcement and include such a clause to waive this requirement in statute, still 16 states have no such clause or exception. Next slide, please. And there is so much more that I can go into for each one of these, and each one of these bullets deserves so much more discussion. But in the interest of time, I want to share with you all our 5 key recommendations before handing it off to our esteemed panel. So on the next slide, please. Yeah, first, before getting into the recommendations, I want to recognize that some states have already begun these practices that we're calling attention to, and which we note as often as we can in the report. This is not to discount the existing work being done, but rather to emphasize its importance. Our first recommendation begins with raising awareness and increasing outreach. This applies especially to Black and Brown communities, which, as we've acknowledged, disproportionately experience violent victimization while also facing the steepest barriers to receiving compensation. We know that many administrators and states are already undertaking this work and doing so with limited budgets and resources. So we encourage states to continue and expand community outreach initiatives that are already underway. In addition to that, in this report, we also highlight a few examples that states shared in their annual performance reports to the Federal Office for Victims of Crime, in which they used available federal funding to conduct things like a victim needs assessment of their state. And we encourage other states to look into replicating such efforts. Our second recommendation is to make the application process more trauma-informed. So often, focus group participants reported being re-traumatized throughout their application process and because of the application process. And so reducing or streamlining paperwork and ensuring folks are connected to victim advocates can help ensure that process is more trauma-informed while also having the dual effect of reducing administrative burden. Third, we recommend states continue to reduce the role law enforcement plays in determining victim compensation eligibility. Again, it is important to emphasize that not all survivors feel comfortable going to law enforcement, and making this a requirement for someone to be eligible for an award is ultimately counterproductive to the goal of victim compensation, which is to mitigate against harm, not exacerbate it. And next slide, please. Next, we acknowledge that funding for state victim compensation programs remains one of the most important challenges, but reimbursement-based models are often untenable for survivors. They simply don't have the funds to pay for services up front. As such, we recommend expanding situations and expenses that qualify for emergency awards, in particular related to burial expenses. And further, while this goes beyond what states can achieve within their own boundaries, we support expanding the Federal Crime Victims Fund and increasing funding to states to support those efforts. Finally, our last recommendation is to listen to survivors. There is no substitute for the lived experience of survivors and the unique knowledge base that they possess. In the report, we highlight examples of states that include survivors on their boards or advisory council, and argue that this practice should be expanded to all 50 states to help ensure this process is truly trauma-informed. Again, I also want to point out that in addition to these 5 recommendations, we also include model policies for every provision evaluated in our rubric. Importantly, these model policies take from existing statute and offer guidance for states revisiting their statutes to update them in accordance with the values of access, equity, and transparency. So to underline that again, for every policy we looked at in this evaluation, there is a corresponding state policy or policies already in place showing that reform is both possible and in some states is already the standard. Again, there is so much more we would like to share with you today about this project's development and results, and we hope that you will take the time following this presentation to read more on your own and look at your state scoring breakdown. But we've got an amazing panel lined up for you today, so I will pass it over to my incredible co-author, Alice Hamlet, who will be moderating our panel. Alice.
Thank you so much, Chandler. Again, my name is Alice Hamlet, and I am a former senior policy manager with Common Justice and a co-author of Hope After Harm. I am absolutely thrilled to be here today with our esteemed panelist. Arisa Napper-Williams is a survivor and founder of Not Another Child and the CVI National Survivor Network. And Heather Warnken is the executive director of the Center for Criminal Justice Reform at the University of Baltimore School of Law. Arisa and Heather are both leaders in the movement to expand access to victim compensation across the country, and it's truly an honor to have them here today to be in conversation about this report. Heather and Arisa, welcome, and let's get started. So
Thank you, Alice.
Absolutely. So we're going to start out with a question for you specifically, Arisa. Can you share more about your experience applying for victim compensation? And also, we know you support many survivors in New York and beyond. What challenges have you seen them face while working with them trying to access to victim compensation?
Well, first, thank you, and CAP and all others that have been so intentional about meeting the needs of survivors and about taking our voice and our experience and putting it into various forms of legislation and other things to make sure that we are heard. And I truly appreciate this space and this opportunity. And so my experience with victims' compensation on August 7th, 2006, the day after my son was innocently murdered in Brooklyn, New York, was trauma at its best. You know, having that phone call that is forcing you to make next steps when you are waking up for the first day in 21 years without your child there, but being pushed to move and to do just to be able to be supported in that experience. And so, you know, the funny thing, the ironic thing is Safe Horizon was actually my support during that time, and I'm still in very much connection with them now. And so that was the traumatic part for me, was the push to do it. You know, the timing around it, which is something that was indicated by Chandler as well when he spoke of the timing. But as I talk to other survivors, it is so many different challenges and complications, from not knowing that victims' compensation even exists to being denied and not knowing why, you know. And so it has been a lot. Those are just two of the main things: the amount of time that they have in order to apply. And sometimes that timing has run out by the time they know that they can apply for it, as well as something else that was spoken of, reporting to police. You know, and so those are some of the main challenges. Some of the southern states, I would say, Baton Rouge and others, they don't even find it deemful to apply because of the limited amount of funds that they are given. You know, $4,500 and $1,500 up front. and we all know that it is a reimbursement model. So by the time they do all of that, they could have done some type of fundraiser to actually get the monies together. But those things have been challenges for myself as well as for survivors around the nation.
Thank you so much, Arisa, for sharing about your own experience as well as the experience of others whom you've supported. Now I'd like to direct a question to Heather. Heather, Maryland has made history with its Victim Compensation Reform Bill in 2024. Can you share more about why this bill is so important and the lessons you think other states can take away from this, especially when it comes to implementation?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this incredible contribution to this work. I know we'll talk a little bit later about how the field can use this tool, but it is invaluable, and it would have made such a difference in our process as we pass this reform. So thank you for the incredible amount of thoughtful work that went into it. It's a real honor getting to tell our Maryland story, because the first thing I want to say about it is how vast and diverse the coalition of organizations, survivors, groups who worked on this really was. Like, this was absolutely a victory driven by people power. I know many of those organizations and leaders, not just in Maryland, but the support we got from around the country to pass this transformational reform are on the webinar today. So I'm speaking on behalf of all of us. And it was so moving for me to read in the report that Maryland achieved the highest score overall. Because one of the things that we decided really early on is that we wanted to pursue a comprehensive and transformational report that really rewrote the statute from the inside out, and a lot of lessons learned from across the country and some of the amazing progress that has been made in understandably piecemeal ways, that one of the downsides of sort of tinkering or taking on only one piece of the compensation program or statute at a time, in addition to slowing the pace of the progress, is that it can inadvertently reinforce these categories of worthiness across different survivor types or different experiences. And so we wanted to take a fundamentally new approach that would address the root of the inequity and the barriers. Our process for doing that actually mirrored a lot of what you did in the report. Really heavily leaned on listening sessions and outreach to impacted survivors across the state. And of course, that includes those who applied and had interacted with the program about their experiences, and those who experienced violence victimization and incurred life-altering expenses on top of their trauma, but either didn't know about it or chose not to apply intentionally because they had heard such nightmare stories in their community, or victim advocates had even advised them not to apply because of how profoundly re-traumatizing it can be to hear from the state that you are not worthy of that help or do not qualify. So this was really a multi-year, many-year process of passing the bill. We had an incredibly proactive and diverse steering committee of different organizations that represented different realms and sectors, not just the victim services and victim support field, but across racial justice, criminal legal reform, many different groups, because this is such a unifying issue, because the program wasn't working for anyone, lots of different types of victims and survivors, but also just in the name of public safety. It was not an effective process. So kind of building that coalition, building a listserv. And another thing that I'm really proud of and was really important to the process, that is a lesson learned I want to share from year one of the bill. We actually secured a small grant from the ABLE Foundation, big credit to them, unrestricted funds to do things like bring survivors to the Capitol, convene those focus groups and listening sessions, have food, have refreshments for people, childcare stipends and transportation to and from the Capitol, a participatory legislative process is not free, although it should be, and it really takes those resources. So we wanted to really create space for that diversity of lived experience and have legislators, policymakers hear that directly throughout the process. And then our second year of introducing the bill, which again followed many years of work on the issue more broadly, we had the game-changing factor of having a new governor, and Governor Westmore's administration actually took on this bill as part of their own package because they really saw the tremendous potential and importance of this reform, how unifying it was, how necessary it was, not just for the healing and dignity of crime victims who we'd been letting down across the state for decades, but for public safety, the potential that this had to interrupt cycles of harm. And so I'll just cover briefly, a couple of the highlights of the bill, but if folks want to get into the weeds of it, you can see that the new law is reflected in the scorecard. But I'm really proud, again, that what we sought to achieve aligns so closely with the really thoughtful and important recommendations that you've laid out in this report. And this really represents a sea change in Maryland, not just for all victims and survivors, but especially for those who have so long been most harmed, yet least helped, least likely to be seen and served as victims, most likely to be denied for this program. So number one, ends the reliance on police reports, which creates alternate sources of documentation, eliminates the requirement for people to report or cooperate, quote, cooperate with law enforcement, increases the benefit amounts for funeral and burial, mental health support, and more, modernizes and expedites the process, changes the composition of the board. This goes to your really important recommendation about survivor voices and lived experience really informing the process, changes the composition of the board, the decision-making body, to better reflect the perspectives of communities disproportionately impacted by violence and incarceration. And most importantly, and this is the transformational part that we really sought out to do, it gets the state out of the business of determining the worthiness of survivors. Once again, and this is so important, and it was such an important part of educating the members about, no, this isn't some soft on crime, this isn't opening the floodgates at all. It was helping to educate people to understand how not just cruel, but how inefficient it was for the state to be making these subjective determinations, based on subjective factors, based on a process that was imperfect, racially biased, and was alienating crime survivors, was alienating victims and witnesses from the criminal legal system. And really that was a game changer to strike those discriminatory factors from the statute. So again, just really educating what a pragmatic reform was, because we've had cooperation, this cooperation requirement that still haunts so much of the country, all wrong. Because instead of this coercive tool making victims and survivors more likely to participate in criminal investigations, it was a really excellent way to erode trust, make people not want to participate in a system that could not keep them safe emotionally or financially. And this new law really is about the fact that we need to start by caring for and resourcing people in their hardest moments for them to even consider participating in that system. And just lastly, a couple of quick notes about implementation, because that's when the real work starts. We've celebrated passing the bill. It was such a meaningful victory, but again, that's when the harder work of rolling up our sleeves and implementing, because the culture eats the policy for breakfast. And we have so much education, so much stakeholder engagement needed to change the way that this functions. And we're currently in the process of working with the state administering agents law, we're actually left intentionally high level because it's often detrimental to be too prescriptive. And you need that latitude to help meet survivors where they are. So a lot of the implementing regulations are also such a huge part of making this reform a reality. And I'd be happy to share with anyone across the country who's working on reforms in their state, some of the resources or more specifics about these lessons learned.
Thank you so much, Heather, for sharing all of that and for offering to serve as a resource. We really, really appreciate that. I'll bring up our next question, which is the distribution of victim compensation has long been characterized by racial inequity, which Chandler alluded to during his presentation. What do you think states can do to reduce these inequities and better meet the needs of Black and Brown survivors? And Arisa, I'll pass it to you first.
Well, first, I want to thank Heather for that roadmap of what states can follow, to increase our accessibility to victims' compensation. I must say, Heather, New York we're on you though. We are on you. We have done some phenomenal work with just the expansion of victims' compensation along with common justice to make sure that victims' compensation is more accessible than guns are, than firearms are, because that is what it feels like at times, that you can you can get a hold to a firearm quicker and faster than you can have access to victims' compensation. But going back to Alice's question, are you referring to the amount of funds that you get for individuals looking to seek victims' compensation, Alice?
You're absolutely welcome to speak about that. Question was around sort of these barriers that folks of color are facing when they try to access victim compensation and what states can do to reduce these inequities that are predominantly affecting Black and Brown survivors.
Yes, so some of the things are, number one, I always think of as contributory conduct, which is one of the things that we just, we didn't even really have to fight. The state saw that it was racist and it was biased, and worked with us on the contributory conduct. And a lot of times because the person that deemed that you have contributed to your own demise was a police officer. So getting those barriers removed, having NYPD and other police departments have to be the one to say that it was a crime or that a person was not contributing to their crime, is some of the barriers that we really, really fought for and against. And it's not just in New York State, but all around. The cap that we had in New York State, as being $6,000 for funeral and burial expenses. I've always said that everything has gone up, even the price of bread, and the only thing that hadn't gone up since 2006 when my son was murdered was the amount that we had to bury our babies. But thankfully we can say that it was just increased to $12,000, and I think Heather hit on something, the warmthness that comes along with it, the healing that comes along with it, and that's why I'm glad that NYPD has been removed and that survivor service organizations can fill that gap because we do it from a different lens. We do it from trauma-informed care. We do it where we're walking gently with the survivor, with those that have been victimized, to let them know that this is the support that you deserve for having this harm done to you on the grounds of this city and or state, and letting them know that they are worthy of this. And so I think that with that, contributory conduct and the amount does not matter if you have survivors that don't even want to apply, because they don't like how it will make them feel. They don't like being re-traumatized. You know, how can we support them and try to keep them out of harm's way from being re-traumatized when something as little as an application when the first line is the victim must have been an innocent victim of a crime. You're starting off bad with that. You know, and so I think that those are some of the biases that have, you know, halted individuals, especially people of color. You know, I think on our part, we need to be doing more community informationals that it is there, because gun violence is not going to stop tomorrow. You know, and for us to be proactive, for us to be there to advise them beforehand that this is the help and the support that you can get when and if it happens, or if you know of someone else, it would be really, really major.
Thank you so much, Risa.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on this important question also, and just really build on a lot of the powerful points that you've already made, Arisa, which is, you know, this has been a notorious feature of victim compensation across the country for a while now, that it's been rife with racial inequity, especially for Black men and youth impacted by gun violence, and for anyone who, for many reasons, might not trust the police or want to interact with the system in the way that these programs are set up in so many places across the country. So we have this growing body of research, including some of the work that I've been privileged to be a part of, demonstrating that Black and brown victims, particularly those in low-income communities, are least likely to be seen and served as crime victims, and that despite their higher rates of violent victimization, that compensation programs in a diversity of states disproportionately deny and/or alienate applicants of color. One of the experiences that really drove these racial disparities and biased dynamics home for me is that a few years ago, I had the honor of leading an assessment for the city of Baltimore on victim services, focused on the experience of the response to Black victims of gun violence. And the themes were so clear and ran so deep, which is that too often Black residents who were impacted by violence in the city, especially those who were poor or had ever touched the criminal legal system previously, were not just facing barriers to getting help, they were more likely to be criminalized in that process, rather than seen as human beings deserving of dignity and support. And we're talking about even surviving loved ones of homicide victims, witnesses at crime scenes, people fighting for their lives in hospital beds after being shot, were experiencing additional trauma, rights violations, coercion, misinformation, barriers to existing services, including compensation, in the course of criminal investigations and beyond. And so many different providers in multiple settings who participated in our study expressed that they felt like they were so often expending their limited resources trying to protect victims from the system, rather than proactively helping them heal, rather than helping them get these critical financial support benefits. So just to underscore how problematic this is, these dynamics aren't just failing those victims and survivors in their most difficult moments, they're actually profoundly worsening the relationship between the community and police and the system as a whole. They're straining systemic legitimacy. They are undermining law enforcement's own investigative goals and missing these opportunities to interrupt cycles of harm. And so really being able to bring law enforcement and others along as to why we were on the same side about why the fundamentals of the program needed to change. And again, now that we've changed some of the pieces of the statute and the process, now it goes back to addressing the culture, you know, and the really deeply entrenched dynamics in this country around whose harm matters, and how so often Black and brown victims have a different experience and level of treatment from the system. And so we can change the laws, you know, we can have these legislative victories, but it will mean very little at the end of the day without the courage to do the deeper, longer, more difficult culture change work that the programs and policies must be implemented. And I think that really must include confronting the role of racism in determining whose harm matters, and moving beyond our talking points that we can't just police and prosecute our way out of violence, to real actions, investments, new relationships that repair and rebuild relationships that are actually rooted in dignity and healing, and a much more holistic approach to public safety.
Thank you. Thank you both for those really, really thoughtful answers. We have time for just one more question. It's a brief question, and it is, how do you think this report will help survivors, advocates, and elected officials forward change and healing? And I welcome either one of you who'd like to kick us off with that answer.
I'll start. This report is an absolute game changer. It really, really is. As we have our monthly CVI National Survivor Network calls, this is something, and the comparison of the states is something that we always talk about, but we never have everything in one place at one time. And I think it also inspires us to see what can be done, what changes can be made. And so, like I said in the beginning, it's like taking just the hurt and the harm of survivors and bringing it into a report of healing. And it's really something that will support us to move this work forward. I think sometimes we try to bite off things from a big lens on like a federal level, but to do it state by state like this is really, really needed. And to have it as comprehensive as it is, to have had the experiences and the voices of survivors to be what it is built upon and what the foundation is about, it's really what's needed. I've been up just reading and going through it and going over to different states of survivors that we're working with, and we'll be at Cities United with about 40 of them, and our plan is to have it up on the wall and to be able. We are just very excited about this because it also shows us that people care. I don't want to just say someone, but that people care and they are willing to fight for us when we can't fight. And in return, we are able and willing to use our voice in whatever way is necessary. So thank you, CAP. Thank you, Common Justice, for this piece of art, I'll call it, that is so greatly needed.
Yeah, that's all music to my ears. And I would just say ditto to so much of that. I agree. This report really is a game-changing resource for the field. Really being able to immerse in the very thoughtful, very detailed approach that you've taken. The report really kind of bridges three key areas that are critical to advancing change. It's very clear about values-driven goals in these policies and these programs, like the why, rigorous analysis of the gaps, and the ability to compare and really understand that landscape across the country, and pairing all of that with targeted recommendations that actually outline and clearly illustrate next steps and resources. Like the model policy language, that in itself, I'm just like imagining if we had that at our fingertips when we were kind of doing that research piecemeal in Maryland. I've worked on this for 10 years. That law took many years to pass, and I'm dreaming about the ways in which this resource and document, but also the convening and conversation power that it has, can fast track that work in other places, because the survivors who are being let down, who are being traumatized in communities, they can't wait that long for us to take that many years to pass these bills. And I just also want to say that I love the collaborative nature of this, because exactly as Arisa said, people care. It's not just the dichotomy around sort of the advocates and directly impacted communities trying to push this change or railing against the system that it's not doing well. There are also many people within the system. There are many state administering agencies and their hardworking staff and victim advocates who are getting stifled by really terrible and restrictive and discriminatory laws. And we're so often feeling constrained about their ability to help their communities and work with survivors and advocates out in the field, especially those who are having the worst experiences with this program. So I really see this as a unifying document, because a part of it, and I hope I underscored this in our Maryland story, part of the game-changing piece was being able to work with the state administering agency, which in our state is in the governor's office. So when a new governor came in who wanted to champion this alongside us, that meant we got to sit down, with the administering agency and figure out how to do this right. So people do care, and we're living through a really rough climate right now, and a lot of cruelty and a lot of harm. And the values behind what this report is advancing is about healing our communities. And I think it's needed now more than ever.
Thank you both so much. I think what you both are pointing to is also that this is just the beginning, and we really sincerely hope that this report will be a tool for change moving forward. Unfortunately, that's all the time for our panel discussion, and I'm sad about it personally because, again, Heather and Arisa are leaders in this and have done so much in their states and beyond for survivors, for communities. So thank you both so much again. I'm going to hand it over to Chandler Hall, who's going to share some calls to action and give us some questions from the audience. And thank you both again.
Yeah, thank you, Alice. Thank you, Heather and Arisa. And that's a perfect transition into just what I want to share. First of all, if you are inspired by today's event and want to keep the conversation going, we have a few ways that you can stay connected with us and involved in future opportunities. So on the next slide. I'd be remiss, again, if I didn't take one more opportunity to plug the report and the state fact sheets. Again, those links will be dropped and have been dropped in the chat throughout. So encourage everyone to take some time on their own to look at the report and look at their state's fact sheet. But then finally, the last thing is that we know that this work will take time and requires collaboration and coordination amongst advocates and stakeholders, as Alice just summarized. And so I want to invite everyone to please join our listserv to stay connected with us and continue this work. Again, we'll be dropping this link in the chat, very quick Google form for you. If you'd like to stay informed about federal and state updates or learn more about victim compensation programs, please fill out that form. And then for questions, because we are short on time, I'll do my best to kind of summarize some of the themes from the questions to get the best out of it. But just kind of starting with funding for programs. So we know that this has been something that has certainly been in flux over the last several years. And because the funding both at the state, often level and federal level is tied to criminal fines and fees instead of from general revenue dollars. There's a lot of complicated. It's been quite a complicated thing, and there's been a lot that has put in jeopardy state funding and federal funding. In particular, we know that now the Trump administration is threatening to withhold crime victims funding for states unless they follow through with immigration enforcement. But even before that, again, this has been something that's always been complicated. Heather, I was hoping I could start with you. This is something that you've written about in some of your previous work, both about the complication and sort of counterintuitive funding that this creates, pulling from justice fines and fees, and then also to some examples that we see have some states that have gone to more of a general revenue kind of funding stream.
Yeah, I'm so glad that this question is posed, because this is such an important piece of this work that we haven't had as much time to talk about today, because the reliance in so many states on fines and fees to pay for this program is such a driver of both an inequity and inefficiency about how this works. Because in so many places, unlike the federal level VOCA funding, which is deposits based on typically white collar crime, at the state level, a lot of places are using pots of money that are generated off the backs of poor Black and brown individuals who are being over policed and in and out of the justice system. And for a lot of the reasons we talked about today, that means that for so many people who are paying into these resources, they are the same individuals who for so long have been disproportionately denied access to compensation because of that very prior criminal legal system involvement, even if it had nothing to do with their present victimization. And so given the financial situation of many states, it's a really hard sell to end a reliance on a funding source. But part of the work, and I think this report, a past report that I co-authored with John Mackey that speaks to this fines and fees piece, why an investment in general funds isn't just the right thing to do, but how it's financially more sound, because we are paying the costs of this violence. We are paying the costs of unaddressed trauma. And when you give people the help they need and address some of these crisis-driven and destabilizing expenses in people's worst moments, it can interrupt cycles of harm, prevent retaliatory violence, prevent future victimization. It is an investment worth making, and more states are starting to understand that.
Thank you so much. And then our final question, and maybe Arisa, I can direct this towards you, is related to the role of social workers and mental health professionals. Are there examples in your experience of how they have played a role in making sure that folks are both aware of these resources, but also have someone who's able to guide them through this in a trauma-informed way? And what role do you think that they should play in this process?
Yeah, I think that definitely they have a role, in this process, because it is so many additional layers of trauma that comes along with it, whether it is transportation, whether it is housing, different things of that nature. The role is not questionable. It is assuring that they are provided with trauma-informed care practices, and that their work is based on just that, so that these individuals do not just become another check off on their list, and or just to assure that they gave them information. It is also how it's being done. And so, yes, the social workers, because with these roles, you may be dealing directly with the survivor or the mother of a victim of crime, but that victim may have had siblings and different things of that nature, or even a wife and children. And so social workers and counselors are needed to assure that the whole family is on this healing process together. But once again, it is just the type of, the foundation that the work is built upon, and assuring that it is done with that trauma-informed care.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you both, Teresa and Heather, for your amazing contributions to this. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for audience questions. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining. Quickly want to acknowledge, I saw in the Q&A that some folks had trouble accessing the listserv Google form. Those permissions have been changed. So if you tried to before and were denied access, please, you can go ahead and do so again now. You should have access. But otherwise, thank you. I'm so glad to see people are already interested in following up with us and staying in touch. We're so excited to continue this work. And we know, as Alice said so well, that this is really just the beginning of this. And so we hope to stay in touch. Thank you all for joining, and we'll speak with you soon.